All right, hello and welcome, everyone. Today I have Father Eamonn O'Higgins, who wrote a new book called Person-Centered Politics. Let me pull up. So Father Eamonn is a full-time professor of philosophy at the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum in Rome, where he currently teaches moral and political philosophy, as well as courses on contemporary political philosophers and the political thought of Joseph Ratzinger. It's Pope Benedict XVI. He studied an honors degree in law at Trinity College, Dublin, and philosophy and theology at the Gregorian University and at the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum in Rome. He was ordained a priest in 1994 and is also a spiritual father at Mater Ecclesiae College and the manager of the Vatican cricket team. His most recent publication is Person-Centered Politics, a Personalist Approach to Politics, which is what we're going to be discussing today. And if you're interested, based on this interview, in getting a copy of the book, I have a link to purchase it in the description. So thank you for coming on, Father Eamonn.
You're very welcome, Gideon. Thank you for your invitation. Very happy to respond.
Yeah, so this is a wonderful book you have here. I think really bringing a unique perspective to a lot of the political issues you face today. So I was wondering if you could maybe just tell us a bit about this book you've written.
Yes, indeed. It's the name itself, Person-Centered Politics, Personalist Approach to Political Philosophy. And really, it's the fruit of my own thought, my own study, and having given lectures in the theme of philosophical politics for a number of years now. And it's a combination of my understanding of the person as renewed by certain modern contemporary currents of personalism, together with some basic and classical ideas of political philosophy. So, yes, the idea, the fundamental theme that runs through it is that our understanding of the person is vital for our political processes, structures, and so on. It seems to me today what's happening is that our structures, our processes are determining who we are as individuals, as separated individuals, as individuals looking just for their own private purposes and aims, and really regarding others as infringement on my own freedom. And that caricature of the human person perhaps goes back to at least the 1400s and the beginning of what we know today to be the modern state through its various developments up until the present. Before that, and now some contemporary philosophers and theologians are discovering a much richer understanding of who the person is. And the basic argument is that if we understand who we are as persons better, then we can determine the political structures that will reflect and enhance that vision of the person. So instead of politics making us a certain way of being and acting, we propose the political structures that in truth develop human flourishing and personal fulfillment. That's the basic theme in the book. And again, when you write a book, there's always the temptation to say, well, this is my new vision for the world. I'm in dialogue with some of the what I consider to be the most profound thinkers in this particular area today. I've mentioned, or you've mentioned, Ratzinger, Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, the French Catholic philosopher, political philosopher Pierre Manent, the American philosopher Robert Sokolowski, and Professor David Walsh at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., and then from a few years back, Václav Havel, the former dissident and first president of Czechoslovakia, and others. So the attempt in this book is to enter into a dialogue with them and using some of their ideas, adding my own to develop an argument that is not just what I think about the world, but is in communion and in dialogue with some other marvelous thinkers. And the book itself, it's 12 chapters. Some of the first chapters are to do with fundamental themes. I explain the present discouragement, the general discouragement with politics today. And this is something, having traveled and lived in different countries, it seems to be almost universal that we are tired, skeptical, almost cynical of what happens in politics today. Politics, yes, we all have an opinion, but we all seem to think that there's something fundamentally wrong. We have a lack of trust. We don't um, believe in the system, the structures. We've got a constant series of complaints. And I think this is more than just a sort of general pessimism about things. There's something deep that our political structures today are denying us. And that's what I want to get into. And I'm saying that deep down, the structures that we live in suppress or frustrate innate inclinations and important social desires that we have as persons. So then the first few chapters are dealing with the notion of person. I take up a fuller notion of person that was developed in Catholic philosophy, also in biblical studies. Ratzinger has a marvelous essay on the notion of person in theology. And then that's enhanced by some modern thinkers. I'm thinking particularly of Father William Norris Clarke, another American wonderful Jesuit philosopher, who has taken some of the modern strands of personalism and combined them in a developed way according to principles and the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, for example. A third chapter is on the notion of truth. And again, what I try to propose is that today we consider that we have opinions about things. We can look out on what's out there and determine, yes, I agree, no, I don't agree, I'm not involved, I'm detached, and whatever I want to do. I basically say that we are born immersed in reality, and we're required to respond in an adequate way both to our own fundamental inclinations and to the reality in which we live. This idea that we can choose and pick and whatever we want to do, and absolute freedom, is in fact a mirage. It's not real. So our experience, the common experience of reality, is the basis for our dialogue in truth. There's a fourth chapter, which is something that I wanted to include, which doesn't always appear in books on philosophy, on living in the truth. And here it's an idea that truth, as we say, is not just an idea. It's not just the adequate correspondence between what I perceive and a mental notion and so on. Truth needs to be lived to be fully experienced. And this resonates with the French Catholic philosopher Maurice Blondel, wrote a famous doctoral treatise on the idea of action. When we live in the truth, we finally come to experience fully that assimilation of reality that we need to grow and prosper. And I also take some practical examples of people who've been called, ordinary people, who've been called to live a heroic degree of living in the truth just by doing what is reasonable. And it suggests to us that, doing what is reasonable, doing what is right, strangely, at times can ask us to do heroic things. And the chapters then go on. There's a chapter on the transcendent social vocation of the person. And again, modernity has taught us to think merely in terms of, as Francis Bacon, the English philosopher, called it, protecting our own estate. looking after, surviving, getting through life. That's all that we should demand of politics. Again, classical thought and some contemporary philosophers and theologians are saying that's not enough. We are not born just to survive. And here I come across, try to explain something that I haven't really seen too much in a lot of work on political philosophy. The distinction between the actual state of the person, the original state, and a future final state. I think there are philosophical traces in us as humans of some original unity that we had, and also at least the aspiration for some final social destiny. Now, those traces have to be explained, they have to be justified, and they have to be given credence and a certain outlet in politics. Politics is not our final destiny, but it does have and should have, I suggest, a positive role in bringing us forward as persons to that final transcendent destiny. The chapters then go on. I speak of, there's a chapter on law and society, what law isn't. Today we've got a very, what I would call, emaciated vision of law. We see law just as, the minimum that I can't do, what's prohibited, what curtails my freedom. And I take the comparison in the Judeo-Christian tradition of the Jewish concept of law. The law was the Torah. It was the way. It was a positive way to God. That was their understanding of law. Law as a path, not law as merely a limitation or a prohibition or something you can't do. So I try to rediscover the real positive role of law, and at the same time make evident that society joins together. There's unity in society, and only if there's something more than just law. The famous Russian dissident Solzhenitsyn, in that famous Harvard commencement address, said that if our Western societies are just based on legal norms, then we're not doing justice to the capacities of the human person. And this introduces me into the idea of communion and what in classical philosophy was fundamental to politics, although it sounds strange to us today, the idea of friendship. That what brings us together in society has to be personal friendship. Now that today in politics, I remember President Truman once said that if you want a friend in politics, well, buy a dog. That's, how bitter and difficult politics are. And it's strange for us to think that friendship, or what we would probably call today in personalist terms, communion, is what we are capable of and what politics needs to help us to aspire to. Because mere restraint, mere law, mere norms are not enough for us to form ourselves in society. I then take on the theme of human rights, the importance of human rights, and at the same time, the ambiguous doctrine that it has become. It seems that today, anything that corresponds to my freedom has to be asserted as a human right as against everybody else. And I think here we're losing the perspective, and we're making unbridled freedom as the foundation for human rights. What that leads to is anarchy. So I propose a fuller understanding of freedom as coexistence, as perceiving the good in others and responding to that good so that others are not a threat to my individuality, but indeed the path to my own personal identity and fulfillment. I then take on the theme of international politics, but I've called the chapter something different. It's called The Unity of the Nations. And I think in a note that you sent to me, Gideon, you mentioned that you were interested in this theme of, what makes a nation. This is something that I've taken up, and I have found a discourse of John Paul II. I think it was in 1994, the second time he spoke to the General Assembly of the United Nations. He spoke of the rights of nations, of peoples. Now, a people, a nation, is a cultural identity of language, of history, of literature, religion that identifies a particular people. Here we're not talking about a political state. We're talking about something much more fundamental and much more important. And John Paul II, in this discourse to the General Assembly, was emphasizing the importance of the rights of nations to exist. Now that, and I think he made the qualification, that doesn't necessarily mean that every people has to have an political independence. What it does mean is that culture and the culture of nations, of groups, needs to be protected. The state cannot try to homogenize people to a particular way of thinking or a particular set of norms. There has to be a respect for culture. And in the end, nations and the unity of the nations is a much greater goal than mere political attempts at political unity. And I think our international problems many times stem from the fact that we are used to bargaining in terms of political states when we need much more to look at the cultural identities among peoples and work on those differences and coincidences to form a much greater idea of the unity of the nations rather than just political states. And then I think the final two chapters, one is on ideologies and their justifications. In the 20th century, we've gone through some terrible ideologies. And I mentioned this and the danger, the damage, the tragedy, the persecution, and the deaths that they've caused. At the same time, there is something in political ideology that attracts us. Therefore, something that is good, but perhaps in an ideology expressed in an incomplete or a bad way. And that's the idea of a vision of the people. I think in the book of Job, it says, a people without a vision perishes. So politics today can't just survive with tolerant coexistence of people who don't invade my own individual space. That the idea of politics having a positive vision of communion is something that we require, that politics won't work otherwise. And it's not just the economy, it's not just personal freedoms and liberties, it's not just keeping inflation under control. Those things are, yes, necessary, but there's much more that brings us together as people. And if we don't consider that greater vision, then we will never live together in a greater peace and harmony. And we see that today. The world's problems are not economic, just economic. There are much more profound issues involved, and we have to direct ourselves to that. The final chapter then sort of takes up that idea of a transcendent social destiny as something necessary for human flourishing. And I ask, well, how is that to come about? If it's not politics, if it's not some political ideology, then, and if it's something that transcends this actual existence, then I think we have to be open to the supernatural fulfillment of something that is entirely human, but is not going to be realized here below. And in fact, the ideological attempts to bring down heaven onto earth have caused, hell on earth rather than heaven. So this leads me into the idea that the religious dimension of life is something essential and also for social and political existence. Today, and certainly in Europe, I think as well at times in the United States, we're living in a sort of imposed secularization um, ideology, which means that basically, if you want to be religious in your private life, in your conscience, at home, behind closed doors, that's fine. But we do not want and do not need any public expression of religion. I mentioned modern, contemporary legal case of the European Court of the European Union, I think 2 years ago, where employers and private businesses are legally capacitated to deny the use by any employee of any religious symbol. Now, the case was about two German women who want to use the Muslim headscarf, but it applies equally to somebody who wears a small Christian cross or some small message or whatever. Now, the highest instance, the legal instance of the European Union has declared that an employer can prohibit this so as to avoid social dispute and not upset customers. Now, I try to analyze what is behind this thinking. Why is religion considered to be a threat to political coexistence? Why do we want to eliminate this dimension, which I have proposed is something essential for our political coexistence? Now, the roots of that secularization, as I think Pope Benedict called it, to live et si Deus non daretur, as if God didn't exist. And they go back a long time. But I think this is something we have to confront, because the exorcised religion from our society leaves out what is central and fundamental to our coexistence. And certainly, there are pathologies of religion. We also experience those in Europe, and I know in the States as well recently there have been disturbing examples of pathologies of religion, religion. But as Joseph Ratzinger pointed out, we also have pathologies of reason. In other words, when we live just with a technical, economic, superficial mentality and leave out our capacity for ethical and religious truth, then we do not live well. And he says that reason without this openness to ethics and religion doesn't even function properly as reason. So that's the basic argument of the book. I have my copy here. I inflict this on my students. I will be doing so in the next semester here in Rome, coming up in a couple of weeks. Thankfully, some of the students have already been interested in it. It's got a lot of footnote references for those who want to follow up on points, because you can't always go into everything in detail, but I've tried in the footnotes to put references to things, should people want to follow up or use this for further arguments or further research. I was very grateful to Dr. Rocco Buttiglione. He is a very famous Italian philosopher and former Minister of Government, who kindly wrote the introduction to this. And I must mention that Professor David Walsh of Catholic University of America was extremely kind in his comments and helpful in his suggestions. And these are two people that have been of great assistance to me, and I just wanted to acknowledge my debt to them. So, Gideon, I don't know if that gives you some idea of what the book is about.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I think bringing everything. I have questions really on almost everything you've said. I think we could have good engagement. No, I agreed with pretty much everything you said. I think we should just dive deeper into stuff. I very much enjoyed the book as well, so thank you for sending me a copy of it. So one thing maybe I thought we could start out on that sort of jumped out at me as soon as I saw the title of your book is this personalist approach. Because when I started studying Catholic political philosophy, my professor was very much in the line of people like Charles de Koning, who were very hostile to personalism. And sort of the Baconian critique of personalism, which we'll also find many other authors, is that we have to first consider the final cause if we're going to consider what's most important. And the final cause in a political society is the common good. So they'll say, no, you can't start with the person. You have to start with the common good. And it's only once you have the common good you can consider a person in relationship to it. And closely tied to this often is a concern that there's not a clear definition of what a person is, and that it might overemphasize sort of individual rights over the community. And it sort of almost seems to be sneaking a liberal vision of politics in the back door. So I'm curious if you could respond to that.
Okay, well, that's quite a question. Simply, I would say, and then I'll try to sort of explain what I mean, is that I don't see any contradiction between an authentic understanding of the person as a relational being and a profound notion of the common good, which is at the heart of political philosophy. Let me try and do it this way. The idea of person, and again, personalism can mean many things to different people. So I'm taking personalism in a particular sense as used, for example, in William Norris Clarke, Person and Being. Now, Norris Clarke was a fine Thomist, and he noticed that, for example, in St. Thomas, the notion of person is developed by St. Thomas in reference, obviously, to the three persons of the Holy Trinity. But St. Thomas did not apply the notion analogously to the human person, to made in the image and likeness of God, three persons and so on. He just didn't get round to doing it. So what Norris Clarke has done is to take the notion of person as explained in St. Thomas and in a comparative way, a diminutive but comparative way, apply it to the individual. And this fits in with the biblical tradition of person as explained by Ratzinger in both the Old and New Testament. And basically what it emphasizes is that not only are we individual substances, we have our own personal identity. You are not me, and that sense of individual responsibility and identity. At the same time, and Ratzinger would say, equally primordially, we are in relation with others and with the other, with God. We come into existence in relation. What this means is then that we explode and destroy the liberal idea of mere individuality, the homo homini lupus, the other person is a threat to my existence, and the idea of private property merely being don't trespass. What we're saying is that the true fulfillment of the person is in the common good of persons. Now that's strange, and I might use a concrete example here. That in class with the students, I say that when somebody comes to my door and asks me for, well, here we owe euros, not dollars. But we ask them for 10 euros, and if I give whoever it is 10 euros, he has 10 euros more, I have 10 euros less. Now, in interpersonal communion, it's counterintuitive. The more I give, the more I become. So when I give to someone, in other words, the more I develop myself in relation to others and to the other, the more I become myself. And this means then that there is no contradiction between my personal good and the personal good of persons in community. They coincide, and the path to the common good is through the personal good of developing that relationship with others and with the other. And that, so in that sense then, explained in that way, I think the common good and personal good coincide, and there is no contradiction. There is no the sense as I used of giving something to someone and then having less for myself. That doesn't inspire us instinctively. But when I realize and when I experience that as I give to somebody else, I become more who I am. That is something positive. That's something that motivates me. And that's something that develops. And I think I would suggest that when the Lord says, like the grain of wheat that dies in the ground so that it can bear fruit and so on, and that's the positive sense of what he means. That we don't just give ourselves away so that there's nothing left. That is sort of hard, but we give ourselves, and in so doing, we experience that we are becoming more who we are. And that's the counterintuitive but real understanding of person as relation and person related to the common good.
Yeah, very much agree with what you say there. I think the concern is if there isn't this robust theological notion of the person, but I very much agree once you introduce that, especially I think what's important here is what I'm thinking of, I think it's Hugh of St. Victor, if I remember correctly, who has this definition of the person as incommunicable existence, that there's something that you can never just put yourself in as another person. There's something incommunicable about being one person rather than another person.
Yes, that's very true. That's a very well used phrase, and it comes up, of course, in Professor John Crosby's work on personalism an awful lot. Now that goes together with the fact that I am also relational. The fact that I am incommunicabilis means that my identity is not yours, that I am someone unrepeatable, unique, and so on, which is extremely important to emphasize today. And some of the ideologies, political ideologies, have said we're just part of some wonderful state of the future and so on, that have denied that uniqueness of each person. We've suffered that. And perhaps some forms of liberalism tend to emphasize only the fact that I am individual and do not see or emphasize the relational nature of each incommunicabilis person. So yes, you're right. And this is what the book is about. It's saying if we understand the person in this way, then a lot of our political structures, processes, and our arguments and our fundamental differences, I think we can begin to find some sort of common ground.
Yeah. So then we'd be moving on a bit to a later section of the book on law and society, right? Here we have a very different notion of law in the past than now. I think it's very interesting is when St. Thomas is discussing law, he's not discussing it in some sort of strict philosophical context. He discusses it in terms of eternal law and the natural law, and then he goes into human law. but only for a little bit, because what he really wants to get to is discussing the old law and the new law. He really wants this theological vision that's really right at the heart of the Summa, is this idea of the transition from the old law to the new law. And you're mentioning here, right, this Hebrew notion of law as a way, as a guide, right? St. Paul puts it in the book of Galatians as a pedagogue. And so I'm curious, do you think that this modern liberal notion of laws just restraining us from doing evil, do you think that that has influenced the way that people think about theology now, because this notion of law is so at the heart of theology?
Yes, that's an interesting theme. And I'd say, first of all, that one of the difficulties of reading St. Thomas today is that we tend to read him according to our own modern categories of thought, and we don't actually understand, as you have explained, the theological context. It's a Summa Theologiae, and that at times we misread what he says. And that's why I wanted to emphasize the ancient Jewish notion of law, because there it's much more evident that the law is a way of living, and it's a way of living in the presence of the Lord and towards Him. And today, unfortunately, a curious point: the Jewish people never called themselves legislators. There was only one legislator. Now, the rabbi and so on would interpret and apply the law, but it was the Lord God who was the legislator. He was the origin of law in its natural sense, and so on. Today, we're very bland about, our legislative capacity and making laws, passing laws, and so on. And this positivist notion of law today really doesn't help us to realize that there is a moral and religious reality that we're living in, and that our positive law in some way should be connected to. So the difficulty then is that law today becomes whatever particular legislator decides. If this is right one day, and then another legislator decides something the next year or whatever, it just becomes variable rules. Now, to get to your point, how our understanding of law applies in theology, what occurs to me is that we have become legalistic in our understanding of theology, of our response to the Lord, our living of the Christian faith. I don't know if it still happens. People used to say, well, is today a holy day of obligation? As if, we've got to go to church today. I hear it less. I think, some people just don't go to church today. But that idea of a minimum requirement of obligation, of just doing what I have to do, is a very minimalist understanding. And I think that comes from our minimalist conception of law. Obviously, in theology, what is fundamental is our experience, the real experience of the Lord that we are capable of having, and that brings us to want, because of our experience, to want to know the Lord, to respond, to live in communion with others, to follow His way, and to experience the goodness that there is in that. That's, I would suggest, is one application of our minimalist approach to law, how it affects moral theology, for example. I imagine there are many more applications.
Yeah. Maybe I want to discuss a bit more of that Jewish notion of law, because I find this very interesting. I'm a convert from Judaism myself. I was never that religious growing up, but I've now been doing a lot more research into real serious Jewish theology.
Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned this issue of legislating in Judaism. I was listening to a talk last night, actually, from Rabbi Yitzhak Breitowitz, who's a famous yeshiva professor in Jerusalem. And he uploads a lot of his lectures at the yeshiva onto the YouTube channel. And he was talking about this issue in Judaism of what are called Noahide laws, which are laws for Gentiles. And there is a question of, there's sort of a list of them that they sort of exegete from Genesis 9 and then also add some basic things. It's basically like their concept of natural law. And he was saying, all right, in our tradition, these all get the death penalty. Does this mean that Gentiles are supposed to just immediately execute anyone for violating any law? And he said, no, that's not how we understand it. It's that this is the maximum punishment. And actually, the Jewish people, they're told exactly what punishments to give out for everything, and they don't get a choice. Versus God gives the Gentiles a choice of how far they want to go in punishing stuff, up to the death penalty. And so and then someone asked in the objections, just sort of interesting, does God then trust the Gentiles more than he trusts the Jews about legislating? Right. I thought it was a sort of interesting problem there that they have then.
Yes, it is. Let me just take up the general idea. We really don't understand our Christian faith unless we understand deeply the Jewish context within which Christianity developed. I've been a guide in the Holy Land for a number of years. There have been renewal courses for priests there, and it's been a great opportunity to delve into Jewish history, archaeology, theology, and there is so much in our, what we call New Testament, that you only appreciate when you understand its Jewish context. So most of it, and that was a little bit behind my thinking of mentioning Jewish law in a chapter on, the political concept of law. So yes, and I think at the heart of the idea of Jewish law is the Torah, which means the way, and this idea of positive instruction. And again, my time in Jerusalem, and you look at Orthodox Jews and the extreme measures they go to follow the norms, the precepts, the mitzvah, and so on. Although our thinking is different, I have a profound admiration for that expression of and the social cost of somebody who is prepared to follow the prescripts and the 619 prescripts of Jewish law and so on. And then it's an interesting thing with the Gentiles. And of course, in Jewish theology, the Gentiles were always called to be part of the final unity of the nations. I think the phrase was the Goyim, if I remember correctly, the Gentiles. It was always, and how many Psalms speak of the nations coming to Jerusalem and so on. Mm-hmm. And this perhaps was one of the reasons, like somebody once mentioned, like for when our Lord goes to the synagogue and mentions that Simon the leper, who was a Syrian, was cured, and no one of Israel, and the woman from Canaan, I think, or that Elijah went to, or Tyre and Sidon, and not the Jewish people. Just to emphasize the idea that the nations are also called and chosen, and through the Jewish people. But that was the context, and that was why I just because of the wonderful instruction in the Jewish law that I was able to learn, and then concepts in St. Thomas, for example, about natural law, divine law, and so on. You see how in the Jewish faith, that was all one. Those distinctions didn't really pertain Um, so we've clarified it, and of course, St. Thomas, what he's doing is trying to give reason its space and its role within the theological context. But it helps us today to go back to when that was a unity of religious thought. And that's why the Jewish people um, give us that wonderful example of the blending of religious and civil laws, because the Jewish laws were about everything, about the way of dressing, the way of eating. It wasn't just specifically religious events in the synagogue or going 3 times to the temple. And that, I think I mentioned it somewhere in the book, that idea that there's a right way of living, I think, is fundamental to our understanding of law. It's there in the Jewish people, and I think analogously we can learn something from that to open up our understanding of law today.
Yeah, it's good you notice, right, that sort of unity there. I was talking with a Jewish friend about this, because sort of an issue that I've always had with the Jewish understanding of these Noahide laws is that they essentially view it as sort of divine positive law still. So it's to them, it's not that we Gentiles figure this stuff out by reason, as it is in St. Thomas, but rather that God gave to Noah a set of positive legislation of these 7 categories of law that are then passed down through oral tradition. And Maimonides actually goes so far as to say it's not merely enough as a Gentile to be following them. You have to be following them because God gave them to the Gentiles. And he saw that as essential to actually being a righteous Gentile. But I was thinking about this a bit more it actually goes so far in Judaism that there is no word in biblical Hebrew really for nature. This is a word, it comes into Hebrew eventually through Aristotelianism, but it's not in biblical Hebrew there, which is very interesting. But going back to then St. Thomas there, I was thinking about, is there something similar in St. Thomas? Because I'm actually working on something closely tied to this for my master's capstone project, looking at the natural law in St. Thomas. And he is very clear that it's not some sort of autonomous law in nature. It's our participation by reason in the eternal law, which is what God gives. So really, to understand the full force of it as law, we have to understand the natural law as given by God. We might understand by reason various things we ought to do, but we don't really come to fully understand it as law until we realize that it comes from God. This is at least the thesis, if I remember correctly, Stephen Brock brings out in his book on natural laws, The Light That Binds.
Okay, well, there are a number of things there, Gideon. Most definitely, natural law is the divine order in creation, the part of divine order in creation that we're capable of understanding and knowing. Even non-religious people and so on. In fact, some non-religious people have a very fine conscience and sense of, I can give an example of that, but so yes, that's very important to understand. Now, what's important also is that our positive law, positive in the sense of posited by men, by our efforts, require that in some way we are referring to what we can all know as true and good. And for example, thou shalt not kill. Well, in most legislatures in the world, there, the criminal law says that if that's murder, that's homicide, and you will be punished. And nobody argues about that. And why? Not because miraculously every culture has suddenly come to the same conclusion, but because different cultures, Christian, non-Christian, and so on, know that instinctively through our moral conscience. Now, what's interesting today, because we have become so used to the separation between is and ought, that positivist mentality in legal philosophy basically says that we can't know what we ought to do. We just decide according to a majority or a legal process as to what we want law to be. And this is something I take up in the book. And if you permit me, I'll just quote from an example.
Mhm.
It's 1989. It's Sheffield in the north of England. And there was an important football match, a soccer match, and 96 fans got crushed as they were going into the stadium. It turned out that some police had been extremely negligent in not following indications or realizing what was going on. But the coroner decided that, these fans were probably drunk and they didn't know what they were doing, so it was their own fault. Now, for 27 years, the families of those who died insisted through all the legal processes that this was not the case, that it was the negligence of certain members of the police force. Finally, 27 years later, the second coroner's verdict declared that it was due to gross negligence by, I think, the man in charge of the police force and some others. Now, what these families did, they went to the City Hall in Liverpool and put up a huge banner right on the city, which said just two words: truth, justice. Now, for me, this is an eloquent example that we all know what truth is. We all know what justice is. When we live in relativist times that tell us that, it's just opinions and nobody really knows, and you can't say that that is true for me because that's only your opinion, so on. These families, and these were working class Liverpool families, with no sophisticated education, put up this huge banner saying truth, justice. We all know what those things are. And I think this is something that has to permeate into our legal philosophy, that the idea of this epistemologic relativism that, nobody has any notion of the truth, it's all opinion. That's not practical. As I say in my classes, here in Rome, when you get to a traffic light, it's not, well, my opinion as to what color the light is. And, at times in Italy, it may well be, but we all know what's red, what's amber, and what's green. It's not a matter of opinion. We can't live in a society. That becomes basic anarchy. But that's the fallacy behind this intellectual heresy of relativism. It doesn't exist. And those families in Liverpool are a very eloquent example of the spontaneous knowledge of truth and justice, what perhaps we would call natural law, but is something instinctive to all of us. I might just say, Joseph Ratzinger said something interesting. He said that the idea of natural law and St. Thomas and so on today has become something of a blunt instrument. Now, what he says is obviously it is true, but because of our misunderstanding of law today, natural law for many people means, what the Catholics think, or what, Pope Francis tells the Catholics to believe, or, the doctrine handed down that can't be changed, which obviously are gross caricatures of natural law. So the idea and also in the book here, was to try to come to a recognition of the experience of moral and religious truth without exactly calling it moral law. But then someone could come along and say, well, yeah, that's what we mean by moral law. So it was a sensitive approach on my part to try to come to the public recognition of truth and justice that we all have. That's the basis of our society, and that legislators need to begin to appreciate again.
Mm-hmm. No, I very much agree. With that issue of ideology you brought up in your book as well, right? I think that nowadays we so immediately think that if you bring in truth to politics, you're going to bring in a totalitarian ideology. And so now we've run away to the other extreme. I remember when I first decided that I'm going to become a Christian. I was in high school at the time, and I spoke with my parents about it, or not very religious Jews. And their immediate concern was, well, if you believe one religion is true rather than another, that's going to lead to genocide. Because that was sort of their immediate jump to, is that there's truth. That means one person is right, one person is wrong. You'll have to then enforce that on the other. And so how do we believe in truth without then going immediately to such extremes?
Right. And that, as you say, is a very common argument today, that if you believe in truth, then you're intolerant and you're a dictator, and all these ideologies have tried to impose visions of truth on people and have caused the death of millions of people and so on. And we need to be aware of that. That has happened in the last century through communism, through the different forms of dictatorship, especially here in Europe. In Germany, even today, there's a great sensibility towards anything that sounds like, dogmatic imposition of things, and so on. And that's a real danger. Of course, the other danger, and it's really an unrealistic proposition, is to say that we can live without truth. That, again, in the book, I try to argue that we're all born into our experience of reality, and that we only live in a shared experience of the truth of reality. Now, just take language, for example. We cannot live as human, but we cannot communicate unless there's a shared understanding. And think about it. The word dog in French is le chien. In Italiano, cane. In French, perro. Irish, madra. Now, it's the same reality, but we use different words to express something we all know to be true. And that's the only way we can coexist, in a shared experience of what we all know to be a dog, for example. So to think that any experience of truth leads to hostility is to jump to an exaggerated conclusion. Something that it's happened in history, but something that has become much more conscious in religions, and thankfully today, is the fact that for any moral act, there has to be freedom. There is no moral act if it's not done freely. I can obey, I can do things under compulsion. But there is no moral act in that unless it's done freely. And that applies even more so to the religious response in society. And again, this is something very clear in St. Thomas. He doesn't legislate for all of morality in society. He says the more serious things, because we can't expect everybody to live a life of sanctity. We shouldn't expect that. It would be unreasonable. So the fact of believing a religious truth, believing that a religious truth, as the Lord said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, that does not mean that I have to impose by obligation that truth on everybody else. Yes, we are called to evangelize, to offer, to propose what we call the good news. But I think there's a world of difference between proposing something in the public forum and imposing it through laws or forced measures or whatever. Strangely enough, today, and I mentioned this case of the European Union Court, today in Europe at least, it's considered to wear a small cross around your neck as an imposition of religion. Now, I see that as a gross exaggeration, as a false reason um, coming from a prejudice against religion and religious belief. The fact that we can express publicly a particular faith is not the same as imposition. I'll give you an example about that. Many years ago, Pope John Paul II wanted to re-establish a procession in the Catholic Church, what we call the Feast of Corpus Christi, which usually falls around June or so, a procession of the Blessed Sacrament from St. John Lateran to St. Mary Major, two of the big churches here. And on a Thursday afternoon, starting at about 5. Now, if there is chaos in the world, Rome, traffic on a Thursday afternoon in June is the definition of chaos. But his proposal was reasonable. It was proportionate. He wasn't saying we're going to do this every day of the year. Once a year on this important feast for many people in Rome and Italy who are Catholic and who are Christian. And I would suggest, in the way it was done, and the side streets were closed off for those couple of hours so that this could happen, that to me seems to be a proportionate and reasonable exercise of religious belief in public. And that's something, if we call ourselves a democracy, should be allowed to happen. It should be allowed. And we have that right, collective right, to express religious belief in a reasonable and proportionate way publicly. Now, what's happening today is something much different. When a student can't make reference to the Christian faith in a graduation ceremony, when somebody who wears in British Airways wears a small cross around her neck and is told that if she continues, she'll lose her job, when anything, any reference to religious purpose in society is deemed to be a threat to coexistence, that I think reveals much more a profound prejudice and hostility to something that's fundamental to social life, rather than protecting the peace. And therefore, to believe in truth, first of all, and to answer your question, it's a necessary social condition. We don't live in society unless we have a coexistence based on truth. Ratzinger said that dialogue without that basis in truth is like a conversation among deaf people. Secondly, public religious expression, if it is proportionate, if it is reasonable, is not an imposition. In fact, it's an imposition of secularism to deny that reasonable and proportionate expression of religion in public. And that's what we're suffering today. So that's the initial answer I'd give to your question.
Yeah. We were discussing earlier, again, that Jewish notion law relationship with the Jewish people. And this is something I think where in the Jewish community, the Catholic Church has a very, very negative reputation overall. We've been working to repair that, but it's overall still very, very negative. And I think the concern is back in the, they might say, all right, that's nice. You guys talk about all these things about religious freedom. You talk about things in this way. But look, when you Catholics really had power, what was it like, right? There was the Roman ghetto. There was the Mortara affair. And they'll immediately jump to these things. There's something I do think has to be brought into account, right? Is, are we going to dialogue with religious Jews on the basis of liberal values or on the basis of shared values between Jews and Catholics? Because if it's on the shared values of Jews and Catholics, they would agree secularism is not the right approach. But I'm curious how you think we should approach this sort of issue.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting and difficult question. And there's no doubt that in history there is a lot that we, and the Catholic Church, easily speak about the Catholic Church, we are Catholics, that we Catholics have not understood of the Jewish faith, that have been subject to prejudice and at times forms of hatred that were anything but Christian. That wasn't universal, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And there are wonderful examples of Christian men, women, saints who recognized the dignity of the Jewish faith and the dignity of the Jewish person. And of course, it is so important to remember the suffering of the Jewish people throughout, the 2,000 years of existence. That's a particular vocation that the Jewish people have had, perhaps have, and it is something that should make us very aware of the delicacy with which we should treat the Jewish faith. And then I'd make a distinction between the Jewish faith and the state of Israel. We won't get into that now, but I would make that distinction. To give you one practical example, I used to go down to a hospital on the Tiber River with a group of seminarians on Saturday afternoons, which happens to be very near what was the Jewish quarter, and in fact the Jewish ghetto. And we'd visit the hospital just to speak with some of the patients, and at times there would be some very old Jewish patients. And I remember some of them telling me, they said, I owe my life to Pope Pius XII. When the Nazi persecution started in Rome and Jews were to be expelled to their concentration camps, Pope Pius XII ordered old religious communities, men and women, to open their doors to receive and to hide Jewish people so that they would not be sent on these trains to Auschwitz or Birkenau or Belsen or whatever. And many did. And it was, for me, it was an eloquent expression when this old Jewish man, and he wasn't the only one, said to me, I owe my life to Pius XII. So we know what has happened, the sort of black legend that's happened, and the communist, after the war, the communist defamation of Pius XII and so on. Engaging the Jewish religion is something, well, we are already engaged. Our roots are Jewish. And I think that is a wonderful heritage that we have. I know John Paul II was the first Roman pontiff to visit a Jewish synagogue when he went in Rome. Pope Benedict did the same. I think Pope Francis also. And I think we all learn over the centuries to be better. I think today, because secularism is so oppressive, that those who believe, one God are sort of necessarily pushed together, because that's what we believe. The belief in God brings us together, and because the pressures, the imposed pressure to deny the existence of God in private and in public is so strong that those who believe in God are sort of necessarily pushed together. So it's a complicated situation. I'll not get into it now, but what's happening in the Middle East, having been there to Israel about 20 times, spoken with Muslims, spoken with Israeli soldiers, spoken with Jewish people, and having friends there on all sides, it's a massive and complicated problem, and that banal answers to these situations don't serve any good purpose. They serve just to continue antagonism. At the same time, when I think back on Northern Ireland and the struggle that there was between Catholics and Protestants, at least they were more, social groups rather than religious differences or theological differences. And then suddenly, due to the work of a few humble men, humble and real politicians like John Hume and David Trimble and others, the Good Friday Agreement was signed, which has brought a much greater degree of peace to a situation that people thought to be unsolvable, insoluble. Now, in the Middle East and the tensions there, we have to pray that something similar can happen because, humanly speaking, it seems to be a situation that is almost impossible to resolve. Unfortunately, what's lost from view, two things are lost from view. One, the religious part of this, the religious faith of the Jews, the authentic religion of Islam, and then, of course, the poor Christians. Who seem to be forgotten or find themselves between these two poles and so on. That's lost from view. This is a political, social, economic struggle. The real men of God, whether they be Jewish, Muslim, Christian, I think have a much different perspective on how this should be dealt with and how it can be dealt with. And I'm thinking of particular people I know and I knew in Israel on all sides who said this. I think here perhaps certain politicians have sacrificed their peoples in order to create and perpetuate tensions and struggles and political ideals that have just caused their own peoples to suffer.
Yeah, very much so. Not wanting to dive too much on the particularities of the situation there, but something that struck me is I have a number of friends there. I try to keep well in touch with sort of the Hebrew Catholic community of Jewish converts to Catholicism. And there's quite a number in Israel. It's probably about 200 of them or so from what I hear from my friends there. But it's interesting speaking with a number of Israeli Catholics, whether they be Jews or Arabs, and then speaking with Palestinian Catholics, it can sometimes feel like they hold the same grudges against one another, that the general society holds against one another. And you have to wonder if among the Christians there, if they can't get together and they hold the same divides despite a common faith, how can you possibly reconcile the two sides then that don't have a common faith? So I think there has to really be a coming together of the Christians there. Maybe they still hold their political differences there, but coming together and worshiping together, because that has to be, I think, then the fact that there are so many Christians on both sides of the conflict shows that perhaps that can be a sign of the reconciliation of the whole community there, of everyone.
Well, what you're suggesting sort of links in with that chapter in the book on the unity of the nations. Mm-hmm. If we move out of the paradigm of international political states and we try to work at the deeper level of culture, of religion, and that type of coexistence, then I think there is a much greater possibility of moving forward and living in coexistence. When we stay just within the parameters of political independence, then it becomes very limited and it becomes a tension between struggles between different political interests. As humans, we are capable of a much greater communion than mere political coexistence.
I think maybe then moving a bit into that chapter on nations then. How do you view the relationship perhaps between the Catholic faith and these existence of these distinct nations? I very much agree with you. We have to consider this sort of prior notion of the nation before we even consider the state. But I think especially for those of us who are converts from communities that are not, where most of our nation are not Catholic, right? How do we then balance that fact, right? Because if you look at historically, for example, how Jewish converts were treated, is there was an encouragement essentially for Jewish converts just to assimilate with the general European population. I think pastorally, right, this made a lot of sense. There wasn't like there was some Jewish Christian community for them to join. Their old Jewish community had, for the most part, sort of excommunicated from their community at that point. But then pastorally, if we want to approach telling our Jewish friends about the Catholic faith, they then view that as we are trying to destroy the existence of the Jewish nation. Because if conversion requires assimilation, then you lose that Jewish connection. So I think there are now a lot of Jewish converts who've taken a different approach, which is no, we still want to hold our Jewish nationhood. And so I'm curious, not just necessarily looking at the Jewish case, but just in general, how do we approach this sort of a situation?
Well, these are, of course, difficult questions, and they have been treated differently and at times badly in history. So there's that baggage to consider and to try to free ourselves from. I remember listening to, and in fact, you may remember his name, there was a Jesuit priest who works with, in fact, he himself, working in Jerusalem, is a convert from Judaism, a Jesuit priest. And I think it was he who mentioned that, for example, in religion, one could think of some type of Jewish rite, Catholic rite, but that preserves many of the Jewish customs and so on, so that it's not a loss of one's spiritual heritage, but a living of a Christian faith according to the historical culture of who we are as Jews and so on. And I know it's a debated question about, the state of Israel. There were some Jews who thought that it wasn't essential to their Jewish faith, the actual state. There are tensions between some of the Orthodox and, for example, the air company El Al that flies on a Saturday, which is something, some Orthodox say that shouldn't happen and so on. And there are tensions. It's, it's a vast problem. But I think, and as something that I mention in the book, that when we begin to look at cultures and, even the necessary tensions between cultures, tensions don't have to be bad, but they can be a stimulus to understand. I've had dealings with a Muslim community in the United Kingdom, and going there and seeing their sense of community and their sense of charity and contributing to common causes and all the rest. It's something that reminds me of something that's in our Christian faith that perhaps we shouldn't lose, although we could express in an equally eloquent way. So the tensions between cultures are not necessarily bad things. And also, again, thinking another aspect of this is reason, that religions, and I think authentic religions, are also reasonable. They don't deny human reason. This was something that Pope Benedict emphasized an awful lot. And therefore, we have a common ground as human persons. And even if there are religious differences that are profound as they are, but as persons, as the respect for another person, as, for example, family life, as respect for property of others, community service, those things. It's surprising how in the great religions, they all have these things. And it's not like, well, that's Christian doctrine. Well, it's, Muslims also do that too. And, Jews as well. So I think one of the baggage, part of our baggage of history to overcome is that religion means tension, or religion means necessarily conflict and disagreement. I mention in the book what are called perhaps wrongly, the wars of religion in Europe. Now, I'm referring to particular authors when I do so. It's not just something off the top of my head. But the idea is that these wars were not really about theological differences between forms of Protestantism and Catholicism. What they were really about is political sovereign independence from spiritual jurisdiction of the church or whatever. That political sovereigns wanted their own autonomous jurisdiction, because you find both tensions between the Catholic and Protestant princes against spiritual authority of the Catholic Church. So that, I think, is an argument that might help us to understand that religious difference is not necessarily the cause of social hostility. So many times there are many other things, much more mundane. And in fact, real Christianity, and in Judaism, it's the same: the widow, the orphan, the stranger. Leave what's not being collected in the harvest for the stranger, and that deference to those who are not Jewish. And in Christianity, well, who is my neighbor? A Samaritan is my neighbor. Whoever needs my help is my neighbor, irrespective of his religious belief. And in the Islamic faith as well, there are there is this dimension as well, that the respect for others who are not of the Muslim faith. Now, there are exaggerations in Islam, just as there have been in Christianity, and so on. But this point of the wars of religion being really about something else, about political autonomy and the growth of the independent civil state over any religious affiliation and its political consequences, I think helps us at least to begin to overcome the idea that religion is at the heart of our political differences. I think authentic religion is at the heart of every culture. And in fact, the famous British historian Christopher Dawson says this, that at the heart of every culture is religious belief. And when religious belief dries up in a culture, the culture afterwards soon dries up itself.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned this issue of Islam. I have a good friend of mine who's a convert from Islam, and he was a very devout Shia Muslim and then was convinced of Catholicism. But in one of the things he'll actually complain to me about all the time is he'll say, I talk with other Catholics and they don't really understand Islam, and they try to just critique Islam, and they maybe have good intentions, but they end up actually just not understanding it, not actually responding. I feel the same thing often when I hear Catholics try to respond to Judaism, is they don't really understand the religion, no matter what their good intentions are. But something he's been doing is he gets contacted all the time by people in the Middle East who want to become Catholic. And fortunately, because of various political situations over there, it's often very hard for them to. So he's gotten involved with a priest who's in a pontifical order, so can go anywhere in the world, and they go and minister to these people underground in the Middle East. But he said a big pastoral issue they've had there is you have these Protestant missionaries who go to these Muslim countries, and they bring with them Western liberalism. So what you end up having is a lot of the reason these Muslim governments, beyond just issues of Sharia law, another big reason that they oppose Christianity spreading there, is they think what ends up happening is these Protestant converts, they become disloyal to their Muslim countries and start to view the West as their true country and start to think America and Israel are their primary loyalties, even though they might be living in countries that are political enemies. And so something my friend tries to do is encourage, if you're an Iranian or a Moroccan, wherever you are, to stay within your country, to embrace your culture within the Catholic faith, and to be a good, loyal citizen of whatever country you're in, and not to try to undermine that country, not to try and undermine its morals. A group he's associated, I think, with in Morocco, They just put out a statement because there's a group of Moroccan Protestants who were trying to legalize premarital sexual relations in the country there. And he said, no, as Catholics, why would we? I mean, maybe in the West, it wouldn't make any sense to outlaw that, but why would you go to a Muslim country as a Christian and then try to undermine what moral laws they do have? That brings a horrible witness to what Christianity is in these countries.
That's very true, and it's wonderful to hear of the example of this priest who does this. Yes, there are a number of things there, a number of points. One, of course, the difference between Islam and the Jewish Christian tradition. Islam is a theocratic state. In other words, political, civil, and religious power are one in different forms and so on. And curiously, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, God never prescribed any particular form of government or any political setup or whatever. And there was always this distinction between civil authority and religious authority. And of course, our Lord then, when he says, give to Caesar what is to Caesar, and St. Peter says, respect the emperor, and so on, that allows for a tolerance of political systems that are not Christian, as long as Christians have the breathing space to live and express their beliefs and so on. That's one thing to keep in mind. So for the Islamic faith, that it's going to be harder to accept that sort of separation of civil and religious authority when they go to other countries and so on. Secondly, I think you're right. One's culture is part of one's being, and Christianity becomes embedded in different cultures. Christianity is not Western. It's not European. It's not American. It is in different cultures. And that means that in Morocco or Egypt or whatever, one can live one's culture and be Christian. And that's, I think, a very important point. Thirdly, unfortunately, a lot of Western Europe is secular, hedonist, and certainly not Christian. And unfortunately, I guess Muslims living in Asia or whatever, looking at Europe that's supposed to be Christian, associate how people, some people in Europe live and say, oh, that's what Christianity is. We don't want that. Well, we Christians in Europe don't want it either, that type of hedonism. And it's one of the wonderful things that in countries and continents outside of Europe, many times I worked in Mexico for 8 years, there's a wonderful faith, a freshness to the faith. They don't have these weird problems that we have in Western society. In India, among the Christians, especially in the southern part of India, in Kerala, there is a wonderful fervor. At times, fathers of families will close the shop at 6 p.m. and bring all the children together to pray. The father of the house will do this. In Mexico, wonderful sense of real piety. And I have found that those expressions are very much, they renew our vision of what Christianity should be, and so that we can move out of the hedonist, secularist air that we breathe here. And most definitely in cultures that are not Christian, we want to make sure that it is the Christian faith that arrives. And remember the thought of one of the very earliest Catholic philosophers, Justin Martyr. He was, in fact, from Nablus, Shechem in biblical times, which is it's a town, as you know, north of Jerusalem. He recognized the seeds of truth in other cultures that the Lord God has sown, that we also need to recognize and collect and use. One of the interesting things here in Rome is that so many Christian churches were built on the foundation of pagan temples. And the idea was not to, destroy previous religious belief, but to say this is the true religious belief that perhaps you in some way intuited in your pagan religion, but this is the authentic expression of what perhaps you were trying to express. Like St. Paul says in the Greek Areopagus, the unknown God, well, it's Christianity. But it was the way of building on a foundation of a pagan temple to say, this is the true expression of what perhaps inchoately and perhaps in deficient ways you were trying to express. And I think that's an important approach today. It doesn't mean, obviously, synchronization or everything is the same and all that, but it does mean that we have a deference to cultural expressions and a philosophic eye to recognize truth, cultural truth in different areas and non-Christian cultures, and to build on that, not to destroy it.
Yeah. Maybe getting in then to your last chapter, to sort of moving to this issue of religion. There was a big discourse in the Catholic internet, especially in the American sphere a few years ago, about this sort of issue. I don't know if you know about the debates around integralism at all.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any thoughts to that, of what exactly should, in practice, then, this relationship of church and state actually look like.
Yes, I heard last year in the States a speaker criticizing integralism, and my fear, and something that I've tried to avoid in this book, are labels. And because it's very easy to label something as something and then criticize it, and then any phenomenon that looks like it to call it by the same thing. I think integralism is not a univocal concept.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And it means different things. So to criticize integralism, then one has to be more specific. And what I've tried to do in person-centered politics is to develop the idea of the transcendent social and religious vocation of persons in society. And that is something fundamental to our development, flourishing, and fulfillment as persons. We only develop in society, and we are called ultimately to a transcendent religious social destiny, in the communion of saints and with God and so on. Now, that in some way needs to be expressed in our mundane, civil, political societies and so on. It's not the case of imposing a religion, but recognizing that we have this social vocation to communion and so on. And how that takes place will vary. One of the questions that students always ask is, well, what's the best form of government? Now, today you'd think it's democracy, but I hold back on that and say, look, there is no one best form of government. What we can identify are certain basic truths of persons in society, and then those need to be applied in different ways according to the circumstances of time and place. You will have times when, like in Britain in the Second World War, Winston Churchill, there were no elections. He was practically had dictatorial powers, but nobody minded. He was the man who led Britain through the World War and needed that power to steer the military effort and so on. So we different circumstances require different forms. But when we have in our minds that we are destined to a transcendent social destiny or vocation as persons in society, then that truth needs in some way to be expressed to the degree that politics can do it, because politics is not the most fundamental bond in society, but it is an important public bond. In some way, politics needs to be open to that. Now, does that make me an integralist or does that make me a liberal? Um, I I think it's neither. Um, I think it's a case of recognizing our supernatural destiny, recognizing that everything human on this earth in some way needs to reflect that truth to the degree that human things can and in their limited way and so on. Um, uh, but that for me doesn't mean having a theocratic state. It doesn't mean having a religious king or monarch. Um, uh, I don't necessarily oppose theocracy, but I don't see it, and it's not an obligation of our Christian faith. It was never required of us in our Christian faith. But it doesn't, not on the other hand, it doesn't mean secular. It doesn't mean this sort of liberal religion confined to each person's private conscience. That is an error, and that is one of the great causes of our political conflicts today, where we do not engage in greater bonds of union with different cultures and so on. So my answer to that is that I think, from what I've heard, the discussion, yes or no to integralism, I think labeling uh, um, this transcendent vocation by one term doesn't help in understanding the principles involved. And so that's why I have tried to avoid, yes to integralism, no to integralism. I think it's always a tendency. He's a liberal or he's a conservative, he's Labour, whatever. Those labels at times preclude thinking. They don't allow us to say, well, okay, he's a conservative, but what is he conservative about? And I think a lot of that happens in politics today. Oh, he's Democrat, he's Republican. Well, first of all, aren't there other categories of thought as well? How many people would consider themselves American but not Democrat or not Republican? So, and then Democrats, what does that mean? And I know there is a whole panorama of views there that are certainly not univocal. And the Republican Party, the same thing. There is a whole wide range of views. So to judge things in simplified terms of Republican, Democrat, integralism, or liberalism, I think doesn't help us understand the greater issues and get to the truth of the matter.
Yeah, that's very much so. So you're thinking then that it's essentially a question of, just like the Catholic tradition has always recognized that whether you have a monarchy or democracy depends on the particular tradition of the society. It's a similar thing to how exactly that relationship between church and state is going to look. But there has to be some sort of relationship there.
Yes, and that phrase that you've used now, the relationship between church and state, there's a right and a wrong way of understanding that.
That's very
I'm sure, as you know. The wrong way is to say that anything to do with religion cannot be expressed in the state, and that the state is secular and any religious expression has to be in private and hidden away and nothing in public. I think we've already discussed that and discussed how that's a denial of the human person's religious dimension, social dimension, and so on. The proper relation, I think, is within the supernatural and religious vocation of the human person. There is a necessary and limited role for civil authority that, according to its competence, needs to have its own relative autonomy. At the same time, and here speaking of positive law, natural law, and so on, those processes and that civil autonomy and civil area of jurisdiction has to be open to the truth, which includes moral and also religious truth. Some of those things are essential to society, and what we have today, the understanding of civil society as something totally secular and denying the role of moral and religious truth, distorts the political vocation. And so there has to be an openness to truth, whether it be moral, whether it be supernatural. On the other hand, and this is something that Pope Benedict mentions in one of his books on Jesus of Nazareth, thank God we have got over the association of religious and political power, where you have religious kingdoms that go on and in the name of the Lord God, kill others and establish empires and all the rest. Thank God that that seems to be over, at least in the Christian faith, and that's something that it has taken a long time to understand. Now, for me today where I live in Western Europe, I think the danger, as I've mentioned, is the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
That here it's the civil authority that has become absolute. One of the interesting things, the word sovereign used to be applied only to God. Only God is sovereign. Now, with the birth of the modern state and through its various developments up to the day, the idea that the state was sovereign. And one of the things I mentioned in the book, this was deliberate. The idea of the social contract was couched in Christian and religious terms so that it would be acceptable to Christian nations, this civil autonomy. The idea of the social contract was the sort of lay version of the covenant that's expressed in the Bible in the Old and New Testament. So political thinkers, Hobbes, Locke, and others used these Christian terms to promote their very, very secular model of political power and control. So that the state would take over all area of public life. And that's something that I think we're suffering from even today. And that's where the false understanding of the separation of church and state comes from. Today, when you say that, most people think of, Christian faith out, no public expression, religion, and so on. That's not what it means, and I don't think it's what the Christian or Catholic social doctrine means by that phrase.
Yeah. All right, so I have a few questions in the chat that I thought we could touch on. The
Certainly.
First one I have here is I'm curious if Robert Spamann's book, Person, The Difference Between Someone and Something, served as more or less a source of inspiration for his book and general disposition. One of the things I liked about your book is you kept citing other people. So you cited so many different people. I don't remember if you cited Spamann at all. So I thought...
Yes, and in fact, the reason for citing authors was that I wanted to do something in dialogue. This wasn't, Father O'Higgins's vision for the future world, as if some Irish professor in Rome, had the solution for everybody. But it's much more a dialogue, and it's trying to fit into a trend that I think is authentic and that's useful. I have made certain reference to Spamann. I have read certain of his work. On the personalist issue, I have really taken more from Karol Wojtyla, John Paul II, the Steubenville professor John Crosby, a little bit from von Hildebrandt. I have read Spamann. In fact, the conclusion to chapter 12 of the book, the final chapter, it contains a short quotation from Robert Spamann. And it simply says, reason is the faculty man possesses to seek God. And it struck me as that a very, very pithy summary of the necessary, what they call today, the expanded reason, going beyond technical rationality. If reason is fundamentally our capacity to know God, that changes, I think, how we look at reality. So in answer to the question, he's an author I respect an awful lot. And there are some references to him. Hopefully in something future that I'm doing, there'll be more of him there. Fine thinker.
Yeah, the next question we have is about the issue of religious indifferentism. So how do we approach the fact, right? We want religion to play a major role in society, but we also live in a society that has many different religions nowadays. It's not like we live in societies that are majority Catholic. Even historically Catholic countries now, unfortunately, the vast majority of the population, in most cases, is not practicing. So how do we bring in religion without falling into religious indifferentism?
Yes, this is a struggle, and there are a number of things involved here. First is the idea of the mixing of cultures. This has happened particularly in Europe and perhaps also in the States, where millions of people from other cultures, and most from non-Christian cultures, have come and are living in Europe and so on. And I know in many cases there are needs, there's political asylum. And then also, and I know Christian Catholic doctrine also says that, individual countries need to calculate, how many people, immigrants can come and so on. And you can't just open the doors and allow cultural chaos, because it's not just economic, it's cultural and possible tensions and so on. That's a real situation in Europe right now. On the other hand, the Christian religion never preaches indifference. Tolerance is not sufficient. The Good Samaritan didn't tolerate. He wasn't respectful of, the poor injured man's freedom and autonomy, and walked by on the other side of the road. Christians, we are called to be concerned for the other. And there's an interesting little book by Ratzinger on the meaning of Christian brotherhood, when he picks up the idea of the sets of brothers in Old and New Testament and what that means. And he says that the other from another religion or from no religion, is our brother. And Ratzinger mentions two things. One, we have to be strong in our own identity as Christians and as Catholics. And people have spoken about the idea of creative minorities and building up strong, faith-filled communities ourselves as Christians, very necessary in a globalized and frenetic society, and mobile and noise and all the rest. This is something that we need to do. But we don't do it to stay within ourselves. We do it not to be indifferent to others, but and not to be merely tolerant of others, but to go out and seek the others. And I think that if we do that, then living in a multi-religious society is not something that will just cause us to forget our own faith. Ireland is a great example of that. In Ireland, everybody was Catholic, so anything you did was Catholic because a Catholic did it. When pressures came and new currents came and so on, a lot of people seemed to lose interest or in their Catholic faith because it hadn't been a personal choice. It was just something we did because everybody did it, a type of conformity. And that's obviously in a multi-religious society, that type of conformity, when it no longer exists, well, there's no longer practice of the faith. So first of all, strong um, collective identities of who we are, but then moving out to others, to those of no religion, to those of other religion, offering what we have, being ready to listen. And I think Ratzinger somewhere says also learning from other religions. As I mentioned, my own experience with Muslims in England, their sense of community, made me think about how important, community is for us Christians. And well, do we live it as the Muslims do, and so on. That type of good benefit, and in that sense, then I think living in a multi-religious society can be something that can um, motivate us to live better. For example, in England, in the United Kingdom, historically there have been a lot of prejudice towards Catholicism ever since the Reformation and the times of Henry VIII. And that meant that if you were Catholic in England, there was a price to pay. And that meant that then that if you were Catholic, you did so consciously because you knew that it required certain things. You knew that there was perhaps a certain prejudice in certain things. So you did it consciously and informed. And English Catholics were always strong in their faith because of that. So I think those are certain positive things that we can do in a multi-religious society that don't necessarily lead to indifferentism.
Yeah, no, I like that point about we should also consider the blessings of being a religious minority at times. I've been listening to a number of discussions on YouTube by this woman who grew up in the Satmar Hasidic Jewish community, which is a Hasidic Jewish community in New York City. And it's interesting, they've been over here in America for like 80 years now, and they still speak Yiddish as their first language. And it's literally like you walk across the street in New York City and it'll be like normal New York City. You go to the other side and many of the men there don't even speak English. And she said growing up, actually, their community was very anti-Zionist because they felt that these Jews were in religious families in Europe after the Holocaust were going over to Israel, and then everyone was Jewish, so they gave up their faith because they didn't need to practice all the religious law to keep up their Jewish identity. Versus if you were a persecuted minority, you had to do everything. And now their concern is very much with assimilation there. And I think there definitely can be some benefit to being a minority in the sense that you then have that identity. I've noticed that even with being Catholic, I grew up on the East Coast of America where there's much more cultural religion. So you'll meet a lot of people who identify as Catholic because their parents were, but they don't never go to mass and stuff. And, went to weddings growing up of different religions. And I never went to a wedding that wasn't in a religious context. Then I moved over to the West Coast where I live now in a very, very secular area. And when my wife and I were planning our wedding out here, we would go to various venues for the reception. And they'd be shocked that we were going to do the wedding at a church. They would say, you're the first people who've ever done this who are using our venue here. But you notice when you go to mass here, people are much more devout in general because they only go to mass because they've really chosen. The culture is you just assimilate and become secular. And so it's a very different environment than the East Coast where that cultural Christianity still hangs around.
Well, those are very interesting observations, and it's very true. And I think it also requires of us who are Catholics, and especially those of us who are priests and bishops and so on, to have a clear idea of what it means to be Christian, the fire of the Holy Spirit, and the divine life within us. I read somewhere recently or heard it that Christianity is not just a moral code. It's not just a particular way of living. It is the divine life within us. The very first Christians were known in Greek as the hoi zontes, the living, because people recognized in them something that was different. There was a presence, the presence of the divine life of the Holy Spirit. And I think we, and especially in Western society, we need to rediscover the dynamism of the Holy Spirit in our lives. And that will bring us, I think, to a much more real, vivacious awareness and living of our Christian presence in society. And an interesting thing that St. Augustine said, people used to complain back then about the times, things were bad then as they are. Things in his time were really bad because, the Vandals were just about to sack Hippo, and, he did have problems, but he answered by saying, we are the times. As we are, so the times will be. And I think that's particularly true for Christians. We don't just sit down and lament, what isn't there in society. That we start, and then I suppose from a parable point of view, you offer the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and the Lord multiplies beyond what we could imagine the effects of that in society. But that comes from the confidence and the belief ourselves in the power that we have as vessels of the Holy Spirit. And I think there's something in our theology that we need to recover and to touch in people so that happens.
Yeah. I do need to wrap up here, but I was wondering if you have any last thoughts that you want to share.
Well, apart from thanking you, Gideon, for the interview with the questions, and those who've been following us, I'm happy to follow up with anybody. You have my email address, Gideon, should anybody want to contact me. There's a lot going on here at our Pontifical University, a lot of good professors, different areas. And I guess my prayer to the Lord is that he inspire us with a new vision of our society. We don't give up on our society. We see the bad things, we have to, but we don't just complain. That we can build again, we can build better. And, if the Lord builds the house, then we don't build in vain. And that's what we need to recover. Let's get rid of the pessimism and the difficulty of things. Pope John Paul II, in his inaugural Mass, challenged people. He said in Italian, aprite le porte a Cristo, open the doors to Christ. And then he said, spalancate le porte a Cristo, push open the doors for Christ in the world. And the economic barriers and the political barriers, he mentioned those. Push open the doors. We've seen in 1989 what happened. How these things that people thought were impossible or that were there forever changed, crumbled, fell. We can do the same. Let's have that confidence. And the authentic life of a Christian can cause a true and necessary revolution in society. That's it from me, Gideon. Many thanks for your time, and thanks to your listeners as well.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for watching. And if you'd like to learn more, you can pick up a copy of Father Eamonn's book. There is a link. I put 2 links in the description, one to purchase it from the publisher and one to purchase it from Amazon, whatever people would prefer. Thank you, everyone.